instructional video, where we will be examining the film audience. I love starting off with a question. So, here's my question for you. Why do people leave their homes to go to a movie theater and see a film? Come up with a bunch of reasons. Now, I'm sure you've come up with the idea of the experience. It's nice to get out of the house and to see a movie on the big screen. Maybe it's because there's an actor in the movie that you like, or a director and you really like their style. Maybe it's a certain genre that you love, horror, comedy, rom-com, drama, maybe even a period piece. Maybe reasons why people go to see films is because it gives them social status. You probably know somebody who needs to see a film on the opening night so that they can brag about it the next day, and of course on social media. So there's just some reasons people go to see films, but I think they also go to see films because they want to witness an experience that's different from what they experience. So different lifestyles, different cultures draws people to leave their homes to go see a film. And now my next question for you. What do you think is the largest age group going to see a film? I know, that's a hard one, right? So the largest group, about 7 years ago, was 14 to 24-year-old white men. But recently that has changed. Not the age group, but actually there are more Latinx people going to see film, but the gender is male. And so when you think about the largest group going to see films, you've got to think about the United States and that we're in a capitalistic system. So of course, if this is the largest group going to see a film, the films are going to be made for their gaze. So what kinds of things do you think a male, whether he is Latino, or he is white, or he is black, or Asian, what do they want to see on the big screen if they are laying down their dollars? I bet you guessed it. Naked women. Think about it. This group is the ages of 14 to 24. The hormones are raging, and good capitalists are going to give their niche market what they want. Another reason why we go to films is because we want to be validated. Films validate. We've talked about this since the very beginning of this course. But I want to take it a little deeper today. So there's this idea of the mirror stage that was come up with by Jacques Lacan, who is a psychologist. What the mirror stage is that there's a point where a baby in their development towards toddler recognizes themselves in a mirror. And Jacques Lacan believes that there's pleasure derived from seeing the self and discovering the self. And so when we go to films and we see ourselves, we get validation. Because that means we are part of the culture. So then there's the exact opposite. So when people do not see themselves in films, it says that they do not belong in the culture. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is you do not see a lot of Asian American films. Now, there was one recently called Crazy Rich Asians. And the one before that was the Joy Luck Club. 2 films all together. That's pretty sad. That says something to the viewer over time, and maybe just on an unconscious level. The same thing you can say is true of LGBTQI plus people. A lot of times, LGBTQI plus people are not in films. They're not characters. And luckily, things have gotten better. There are more gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered people in film and on TV. But that's really recent. Before that, all of the depictions of LGBTQI plus people ended up having those characters killed, and they couldn't talk about themselves in a full way. And terrible words were brought up about being LGBTQI plus. So the films weren't making people feel good about themselves. It was keeping culture the same, because at one point gay people were not accepted at all. So hopefully that gives you an idea about why validation in films is so important, and it reminds you of things we've talked about in the past. Now, another thing that we should talk about is, besides the near stage, there's also pleasure. And Freud came up with this idea of the psychological model, which is the ego, the id, and the superego. And we're going to talk about the id and the superego. And the id is the place I like to think of as taboo. It's where all of the pleasure is. It's sex, drugs, rock and roll, hip-hop music, whatever. It's all of those things. It's this sort of desirous impulses that we have. And to stop us from going full throttle, we have the superego, which is like this thing that judges, that has an awareness of morals and ethics, and keeps the id's impulses in check. A lot of times it's like having an angel on one shoulder and the devil or a demon on the other shoulder, and they're battling for, I don't know, too much alcohol. And they're battling for more alcohol, let's say. And of course, the demon says, have more, and the angel's saying, don't, and tells you all the reasons why you shouldn't. So, movies are pleasurable. They help us escape from life. And Freud discussed the id is involved in the pleasure principle. The id always wants and hungers after pleasure. And the superego is the reality principle. It keeps the id in check. So, pleasure is a really big reason why we go to see films. But not everybody is pleased by the films being made. Feminists have looked at films for years, decades now. And what they came up with is the male gaze. When you watch a film, notice how a woman's body is displayed on film. Oftentimes, we see the camera moving up from her feet, through her legs, pelvis, up through her torso, and finally to her face. That is the way a lot of women are revealed. Or their bodies are cut up, and you're focused on the tuchus and the chest. And women, feminist women, have problems with this, because men are not treated in the same way in film. It is very rare that you see a man's body cut up, or that you have that reveal. The only time I really see that reveal of a man is when you're watching a Western and we start off with the cowboy boots and the spurs, and it moves up. And what's kind of interesting is I always feel like it's in front of a saloon, and there's those doors, the swinging doors, so you actually don't see anything from his knees to his chest, and it goes right to, the top of his torso, neck, and head. It's something that I've experienced many times. And you have to think about that. A lot of the 14 to 24-year-olds probably going to movies are heterosexual, or at least Hollywood thinks they're all heterosexual. Sticking with feminism for a moment, in 1985, I believe, Alison Bechdel, a cartoonist, came up with a test to look at the representation of women in fiction. And the test is rather simple. Alison Bechdel believes that a film, well, the test, has three components. The first component is that there's more than one woman in the film. So two or more. The second component is that these women have to talk to each other. And the third component is they have to talk about something other than men. A lot of times, women in film, when they get together, discuss their woes and triumphs with men and very little else. Now, just because a film passed the test doesn't mean it's a good representation of women. What it's about is the underrepresentation of women in fiction. I should also say that it's known as the Bechdel-Wallace test because Alison Bechdel credits one of her friends for coming up with or inspiring the test itself. So it's also known as the Bechdel-Wallace test. And as I'm thinking about feminism and other types of people seeing film, other than that 14 to 24-year-old white and or Latin men, I think about pleasure as well. Everyone deserves to go to films and receive some enjoyment and pleasure. And the one thing we haven't discussed is voyeurism. A lot of critics have come up with the idea that people love going to films because of this idea of the voyeur. And another way of expressing that is a peeping Tom. So when we go to a film, we sit in this dark place and we're watching this people on the screen that do not acknowledge us. So it's like we are a fly on the wall, or we're peeking in through the window, or we have our own little hidden camera watching this life before us. Now, of course, the actors in the film and the directors and the people who make the film realize it's being watched, clearly. But they act as though they don't. There are very few films where the actor breaks the fourth wall and directly addresses the audience. What voyeurs get, or what gives them the pleasure, is that they're watching an unexpected, a person who's unsuspected, I can't get this out correctly, that the person is watching an unsuspecting person. That doesn't even sound right. Arg. I hate being tongue twisted. So what I'm trying to say is an unsuspecting person is being watched. And that gives the voyeur a sense of pleasure and power. They feel in control and that they're getting away with something. So it's not just sexual. There's a couple things in there. And so films and the way we view the films recreate that experience in the movie theater, the way they're made and the way the movie theater is set up. I think that is everything I want to discuss with the film audience. But what I want you to do with all these things I discussed is notice how films operate for the audience. So as you're watching Her or movies on TV in your own time, think about who the film was made for. And with that said, I hope you got a lot out of this video. And I hope I have grown your mind a little bit further. Have a great week.